In the last lecture, we talked about why people resist change and why individuals, groups, and organizations sometimes respond in a dysfunctional manner to a threat or change in the external environment. In this lecture, we're going to look at successful transformation. What are the key phases in an effective change process? What must leaders do at each stage to be successful? And we'll also look at what some of the common mistakes are that leaders make as they try to enact a transformation process. Let's start with an example of a company that struggled with change. In particular, we want to talk about the notion that at the beginning of a change process, you need to unfreeze old assumptions, old mental models, and the like. And sometimes that can be very difficult, but it's a crucial step in any change process. The company I'd like to look at is Blockbuster, a firm that dominated the movie rental business for many years, but ultimately has ended up in bankruptcy. Let's go back to the beginnings of its demise. Netflix was founded in 1997. Think for a moment about the Blockbuster customer and the Netflix customer at that time. Who was going to Blockbuster and why were they going there? Well, typically it was the soccer mom driving a minivan with 2.5 kids and a dog. On a Friday night, she was going to pick up takeout, and at that same suburban strip mall, she was walking into the Blockbuster. Where was she going when she entered the store? Typically, the new release wall. She was looking for family-friendly new releases. She was renting them with her children in tow. She was typically renting VHS tapes at the time to play on her VCR at home. Now, who was the Netflix customer back then? Well, it was a young male, typically college age or in their 20s, as I like to say, living in their mother's basement, renting DVDs and not renting new releases typically. Instead, they were renting cult classics. They were looking for, that same Monty Python movie they'd watched 10 or 15 or 20 times over. They were much more willing to try out independent films, other movies that weren't mass market hits. Fundamentally, the Netflix customer at the beginning was very different than the Blockbuster one. This is a story of how many disruptive technologies emerge. Clay Christensen coined this term disruptive technology in the mid-90s. The notion is that sometimes incumbents get disrupted by startups who at first are serving people who are not at all the core customer of the incumbent. They're serving the unmet needs of a fringe market, of a small segment of consumers. Now, what's happening with the incumbent? They're doing what all the marketing experts tell them to do. They're listening to their core customer. They're listening to that soccer mom in the case of Blockbuster. But of course, that soccer mom is not thinking about DVDs or cult classics or Monty Python for the 15th time. So she's not able to help them understand the change that needs to take place. And Blockbuster was very slow in responding. They were stuck in this conventional wisdom that said, we rent new releases. So in the 2000s, increasingly new releases were forming even bigger and bigger portions of the store footprint. Why? Because they continue to hear from customers, we're frustrated when we go to find a hot new release and it's not there, it's not available because all of the copies are rented out. So Blockbuster was pouring even more money into buying more copies of new releases. But the new release business is not a very attractive one, actually, because what happens 3 or 4 weeks after a movie hits the market? Now you're stuck with so many copies of a movie, you don't need them all, and you end up having to sell them off at a steep discount. Netflix built this model on trying to recommend to people non-new releases that were interesting to them by developing personalized recommendations for each consumer. It was a powerful new way of looking at the rental market. Blockbuster couldn't break the old assumptions. They couldn't break out of the conventional wisdom. They couldn't unfreeze the organization. Eventually, of course, they tried to adapt. They went online and they offered movies shipped to the home and the like. And then while they did that, along came Redbox, revolutionizing the new release market, the one that Blockbuster had dominated for so long. What Redbox realized was if people only care about a few movies, those few hits that have just hit the market, we don't need a whole store to serve them. We can do it with a vending machine. And we'll do it in the supermarket or in a pharmacy or at a gas station. And so now Blockbuster got themselves caught between a rock and a hard place. On the one side, Netflix was bashing them with the consumer who cared about movies that weren't the recent hits, and Redbox was getting them on those new releases. And Blockbuster went bankrupt. An example of what Kurt Lewin talked about when he said any change process involves unfreezing, changing, and then freezing. What did he mean by that? Well, unfreezing is recognizing the need for change, being willing to unlearn old habits and challenge the conventional wisdom. And Blockbuster couldn't do that. They were stuck in an old way of thinking about the business model. And Redbox and Netflix invented two fundamentally different ways of serving different kinds of customers. And then, of course, changing is about devising new strategies and new ways of working, and using pilots and experiments to explore those new paths. And then finally, freezing is about institutionalizing change, ensuring continuity through leadership succession, making sure that changes stick. So unfreeze, change, freeze. That's the fundamental paradigm that has governed all leadership work looking at how transformation takes place. Let's begin by looking at unfreezing in a little more detail. As Gary Hamel and David Garvin have pointed out, there's sort of 4 steps in unfreezing. You first have to clean the lens, they say. Then you have to effectively widen the lens. Then imagine a new future and decide which path you wish to pursue. By cleaning the lens, they mean you have to examine and challenge the orthodoxies in your organization, remove blind spots, develop a restlessness with the status quo, and visualize what does not exist at the moment. So you have to wipe the slate clean, if you will. And then you have to begin to effectively widen or broaden your view of the world, ask new questions, acquire new perspectives, develop new foresight, look at trends and discontinuities that are disrupting the status quo. And only then, after you've wiped the slate clean and begun to broaden your perspective, can you imagine a new future and make decisions. How do you test your assumptions and unfreeze those old, entrenched mental models? Some questions that Hamel and Garvin pose are, first, ask yourself, what do company and industry leaders believe about who the customer is and what they want, and how products and services are developed, marketed, and sold, and the way in which companies can add value? And then ask yourself, what are the things you would never hear a customer, supplier, or senior manager say about our company or industry? And 10 things that all people believe in common. These kinds of questions begin to reveal the orthodoxies that could be outdated. And then you can ask, which of these orthodoxies and assumptions deserve to be questioned? Which ones might in fact no longer hold? And can we gather some data to validate those assumptions? And Blockbuster would have been well served by asking some of those questions about some of those orthodoxies they held about the importance of brick and mortar stores, the importance of devoting such a large percentage of their footprint to new releases, and the like. John Kotter is one leadership scholar who's unpacked this unfreeze, change, freeze model into more discrete phases, into smaller steps that we can think about as we lead a transformation. In fact, he's outlined an 8-step model that many people throughout the world have adopted as their model, their framework for thinking about how to lead transformation. Kotter not only teaches about leadership, but he's been a consultant to many executives in the public and private sector who've had to deal with difficult, wrenching changes in their organizations and environments. Step 1 in any change process, he argues, is to establish a sense of urgency. You have to examine the market and the competitive realities, identify crises and untapped opportunities, and then you have to persuade a large majority of people that the status quo is more dangerous than the unknown. Very important, that contrast between the status quo and the unknown, because it's not enough to just get them restless with the status quo. You have to convince them that staying there is riskier than going off into this very ambiguous, very disconcerting unknown in the future. Jack Welch put it well when he said, You have to see the world as it is, not the way you wished it were. And many of us, in fact, are looking at the world through these rose-colored glasses, that say, oh, things are okay. So establishing that sense of urgency is important. You often hear people talk about creating a crisis, or you have to tell people about the burning platform if you want to drive change. This is the notion, that if the platform, an oil platform, is burning, that, you're likely to see people jumping off, that at that point they realize they're in grave danger. And so you have to convince people that the platform is burning to get them to jump out of their old ways of working. This metaphor has been used time and again by leaders in thinking about change. Just recently, we heard it from the new CEO at Nokia. Nokia, of course, a very, very successful phone company over the years, particularly in emerging markets with low-cost phones that could serve the needs of low-income consumers. They had done remarkably well. But with the emergence of smartphones, with BlackBerry, with the iPhone, with the Android phones, Nokia found themselves in deep trouble. All of a sudden, they were losing market share around the globe. And what did the new CEO do? He wrote a memo outlining the burning platform, getting people to see how bad things were. But I want to point out, you have to be careful here. You want to create a sense of urgency, but you don't want people to believe you're fabricating a crisis. In Nokia's case, it's very much a crisis. The numbers are stark. Market share has been plummeting. Profit is down. Sales are down. And the world is in love with its competitor's product. But you have to make sure you ground your arguments in reality. That doesn't mean it's all about facts and numbers. You have to consider people's emotions, no question about it. But you can't just create crisis when it doesn't really exist. People will begin to say, this is the boy or the gal who cried wolf. And that can be dangerous. You can lose the trust of your subordinates if you fabricate crisis simply to get your agenda enacted. Last thing I'll point out on this is that you do have to think about people's options. What are their opportunities going forward? In some sense, as a leader, you have to degrade those options a bit, or at least show people how some of those future options aren't so attractive, and that going off into this unknown of the transformation you propose is actually better than some of the other alternatives they will face if they don't change. Step 2. What is step 2 in Kotter's model? Well, he would argue that you have to form a powerful guiding coalition. That is, you need a whole team of people working with you on the effort. You can't go it alone. And presumably, the key people will be champions of change, people who have great credibility, status, and power in the organization. It's important to find people who are influencers. If they have credibility, if people trust them, if they have status in the organization, they are going to be very helpful to you. You need champions who people respect, who people will look to and be willing to follow. So this is a very important concept, the notion of the guiding coalition. It suggests that transformation is absolutely about shared leadership. Without shared leadership, it's unlikely you can push a change forward. Well, when do you form that coalition? Let me tell you a story about Julie Marath, the Chief Operating Officer for many years at Children's Hospital in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Now, she took over at an interesting time. In the late 1990s, the Institute of Medicine had issued a stark, disturbing report about the number of medical errors in America. And all of a sudden, the spotlight was on hospitals throughout the country to improve patient safety and reduce medical accidents. Julie Marath had embraced that report and the need for change. And here she was coming to this new organization where she was going to be number 2 in command. And her vision was to enact a radical, transformational strategy that was going to drive improvements in patient safety in the hospital. Now, how was she going to do that? What she realized was she would need a whole bunch of people on her side. She was a nurse, not a doctor. She was an administrator. She knew she'd need the physicians on her side. She knew she'd need nurses and other staff on her side, as well as patients and their families. So she began to form her coalition. And what's so fascinating about the Julie Marath story is that she was forming this coalition for change beginning during her interview process, while she was being hired. As they were interviewing Julie and trying to determine if she was the right candidate for the COO job, Chief Operating Officer job, she was interviewing them. She was beginning to detect which of these people might in fact be partners with me in a change process? Which of them is willing to buy in to the notion that we need to focus on patient safety? Which of them is willing to admit that maybe we're not doing things the right way with regard to medical accidents and that we can do better? And so by beginning to feel people out, to determine not only how capable people were, but how willing they were to come along in this transformation process, she was forming her coalition. And by the time she stepped into the role and had been hired, now she had a team of people that could join her on what she called the Patient Safety Steering Committee, a group that would oversee the transformation of the hospital. Julie had great success at Children's Hospital and Clinics. She began to attract mass media attention throughout the country. Her hospital was featured on the cover of U.S. News & World Report. We wrote a case study about it at Harvard, and she began to give lectures throughout the country. But she always stressed that she could not have done it alone. She needed that team, and identifying them early was critical in getting off to a fast start in the transformation process. Step 3 in any change process. Here, Kotter argues you need to create a compelling vision. And this is perhaps the most important step, because here many companies get it wrong. Their visions are too complicated or too vague. They're generic in so many ways. Kotter argues it has to be something you can communicate in a very short period of time, in a matter of minutes. The question you might ask yourself is, can you explain it to your mother? I want to ask you, before we go any further, to think about the mission statement or the vision at your own organization. As you recall it, think about how generic it sounds. Is it fundamentally different than the mission statement at your rivals? Or could it be up on the wall at any company in your industry or any agency in the public sector? Is it fundamentally unique in any way? Now, you may even have a hard time recalling your mission statement or vision. Boy, that's a problem, right? Is it so generic that you can't even recite it? Or perhaps it's long-winded. It's so long and wordy that you can't possibly remember it. That's a problem, too. Jim Collins and Jerry Porras wrote a very famous book about what constitutes an effective vision. Their book looked at companies that had enduring competitive advantage. It was called Built to Last. And in it, they proposed a model for what constituted an effective vision. They said it had 3 parts: purpose, values, and what they called a BHAG, a big, hairy, audacious goal. Values and purpose were enduring. They were about preserving the core of the organization over a long period of time. BHAGs, big, hairy, audacious goals, were about stimulating progress and driving an organization into the future. Let's start with purpose, the first core element in vision, according to Collins and Porras. Let me give you some examples of what they mean by purpose. As they say, purpose is about what's your reason for being as an organization or institution. At Harvard Business School, it's to educate leaders who make a difference in the world. A simple phrase that everyone remembers. At Boeing, it's to eat, breathe, and sleep the world of aeronautics and to be on the leading edge of aeronautics. At Merck, it's to preserve and improve human life. Perhaps even simpler, at Disney, it's to make people happy. And who can forget GE's slogan, "We bring good things to life," exemplifying the culture of innovation that the organization has had for more than 100 years. So purpose is enduring. It's a simple phrase that helps people understand why do we exist as an organization. Now what about this thing, big, hairy, audacious goal that Collins likes to talk about? Well, let me take you back to John Kennedy in 1961. You all know, of course, that Kennedy outlined a vision, a big, hairy, audacious goal for the space program. Sputnik, of course, had startled America. It felt like it was falling behind the Russians, the Soviets, in the space race. And now here at the beginning of the 60s, America was ready to mobilize its resources. And he set forth an audacious goal. We were going to get to the moon by the end of the decade. Of course, that goal was realized long after Kennedy had been assassinated. In 1969, Neil Armstrong walked on the moon, fulfilling the vision. Now, what did Kennedy say back in 1961 when he mobilized the country and the federal government in pursuit of this vision? What he could have said, like many corporations say with their mission or vision statements, he could have said, My goal is to make the NASA space program the preeminent space exploration initiative in the world. Sounds wonderful, perhaps accurate. Not very compelling, is it? Not very memorable, is it? What did he actually say in 1961?
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth.
That is a memorable statement. Many people have seen clips of it over the years, and many people remember the essence of that statement. Well, Collins and Porras identify 4 characteristics of a good, big, hairy, audacious goal. And Kennedy's vision for the space program meets all 4 of their criteria. First, they argue, a BHAG, a big, hairy, audacious goal, must be simple. It must be finite. It must be far out, and it must be stretch. Simple, land a man on the moon. Very clear. Finite, you have to know when you've reached it. So he said, well, it's when we bring him back safely to Earth. It's far out, 5 to 10 years out. In Kennedy's case, he made it very clear, by the end of the decade. And then it has to be stretched. It has to be ambitious, but not impossible. People have to dream, but it has to be a dream they feel is attainable. So Kennedy met all of these criteria. It's why it was such a powerful vision for the space program. So big, hairy, audacious goals are finite. Purpose is never ending. Interestingly, we can compare this in the realm of the private sector and look at good and bad visions, or good and bad, big, hairy, audacious goals. And I think you'll find that you can connect with this contrast, because you may very well have an organization that is unfortunately on the negative side of this comparison. Think about General Electric in the 80s. We talked about Welch, right? His vision, become number 1 or number 2 in every market we serve. Meets all 4 criteria: simple, finite, far out, and stretch. Westinghouse in the 80s had a board that was up on walls throughout the company. It outlined its vision for the 90s. And there were 6 phrases: total quality, market leadership, technologically driven, global, focused growth, diversified. Boy, those 6 things could be up on the wall of thousands of companies throughout the world. Nothing unique to Westinghouse in that statement, nor anything compelling, and emotionally, there's no connection to the people in the organization. They don't feel any passion for those 6 phrases. Very different than Kennedy's moon statement or other big, hairy, audacious goals that have been set out that are simple, finite, far out, and stretch. And lastly, there's values. Any vision has to also talk about the values of the organization and translate those values into behavior. In other words, you have to clearly articulate the values, explain the desired behaviors you want, and then evaluate and hold people accountable based on those behaviors. Step 4 in the Kotter model. Now that you've articulated the vision, you have to remember that you have to use multiple vehicles to communicate the vision. This is a very important point. The notion that we often forget that it takes many repetitions before the message truly sinks in, and that different people process information in different ways. So we need to make sure that we're communicating the vision in different ways, sometimes in writing, sometimes in one-on-one meetings, sometimes in speeches before large members of an institution. We have to be persistent and repetitive. We have to sustain our communication. We have to remember that we need to speak to and address multiple stakeholders and constituencies, not just our own employees, our board, our customers, our suppliers, etc. And we have to use our guiding coalition, that team of people that's working with us to champion the change. They have to model the new behaviors that we desire. They have to be exemplars for the organization. That's really important. Admiral Rickover, the father of the nuclear navy, particularly the nuclear submarine navy in the United States, once said, "Good ideas are not adopted automatically. They must be driven into practice with courageous patience." Jack Welch also talked about this notion of patience, of repetition, of simplicity. He said, you don't get anywhere if you keep changing your ideas. The only way to change people's minds is with consistency. Once you get the ideas, you keep refining and improving them. You communicate, and then you communicate some more. Consistency, simplicity, and repetition is what it's all about. So when we're communicating that vision, we have to remember that. Not just that it's simple, but that we're consistent and that we repeat our message time and again in different ways to different audiences through different forms of communication. Step 5. We need to empower others to act on the new vision. That means beginning to make changes in the organizational systems, structures, and processes. Perhaps most importantly, to alter the incentive systems if necessary. And we're going to talk more about incentive systems and motivation in some upcoming lectures. We may need to bring in new people, new blood into the organization to execute certain changes. Collins talks about getting the right people on the bus, and that certainly is important. We have to encourage risk-taking through the seeding of small experiments and pilots, and then think about perhaps some major demonstration projects to prove to the world, to the organization, that a new way of working is feasible and that it can be effective. So pilot projects that can demonstrate success and build momentum are critical as we empower others to act on the new vision. Step 6. We need to plan and create short-term wins. We need to find low-hanging fruit. It's so important to build momentum and build some confidence in the organization that this unknown, this new way of working, actually might work. So small wins are critical for proving our concept, for showing concrete early results. And we want to reward people who can achieve these small wins, who can actually go at some of this low-hanging fruit and get some traction. Small wins are these victories that nourish faith in the change effort, says Kotter. They're emotionally rewarding. They help keep the critics at bay. So critical. Think about this in the realm of politics. So many people, going all the way back to the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt, talk about the first 100 days of a presidency. But remember, the question isn't simply whether you can pass legislation in those 100 days. It's about whether you can create some short-term positive results that build support for your change, that show people that your way of working, your new strategy, actually can gain traction and produce results. I think one of President Obama's challenges is that he wasn't able to produce some of those short-term wins. He wasn't able to identify some of those low-hanging fruit to create tangible, near-term improvements in the economy. And therefore, he wasn't able to get as many people perhaps on board as he might have. You know, Bill Parcells, a very famous football coach, has an interesting perspective on small wins in any transformation process. As you may know, Parcells is a master turnaround artist. He's gone to team after team that felt things were hopeless, that had lost many, many games, and he's turned them around in remarkably short periods of time. He first did it with the New York Giants, a perennial loser for 2 decades that he took all the way to Super Bowl victory 2 times. He then went to the New England Patriots, a team that had won only a few games a year before he had gotten there, and then gradually he built them up and took them to the Super Bowl. He went to the New York Jets, who hadn't won a Super Bowl in decades, and gradually built them back up from a team that only won 1 game and lost 15. And suddenly they found themselves competing for a championship. And even in his last stop, where he wasn't nearly as successful, he still did turn around the culture and win quite a number of games at the Dallas Cowboys. How did he do it? How did he think about transforming these organizations that were in such desperate shape? Well, he talks about what he did in training camp. He said, you know, we don't focus on the ultimate goal in training camp when we're getting people ready for the season. The ultimate goal is getting to the Super Bowl. We establish a clear set of goals that are within immediate reach. When we start acting in ways that fulfill those goals, I make sure everybody knows it. In other words, he wants early concrete results to build momentum. Step 7, we need to consolidate improvements and produce more change. This is about bringing in new blood, continuing to have new projects that are going on. The danger here in this phase, says Kotter, is that we will declare victory too soon and start backsliding. And Parcells, unfortunately, experienced this in many of his turnarounds. Often we saw with his teams in year 2 that the team actually regressed. In year 1, they'd make this great leap forward as he transformed the culture to one of winning. But then in year 2, often they'd take a bit of a step back. That happens in many business organizations as well in transformation processes. And lastly, step 8. Here's when we have to get to that freeze stage. We need to institutionalize new approaches. That means making sure we have new metrics, norms, and values in place that we have strong alignment among strategy, goals, metrics, and rewards, that we have clear leadership development and succession plans in place. Remember, if it's just about the leader as turnaround artist, and we don't have succession plans in place, then the effort may dissipate when that person moves on. And in many cases, the right leader in a turnaround is very much a turnaround artist, someone who will want to move on, who doesn't really thrive in an environment where things are successful and they're trying to continue to build on success. They like to go and be a fixer-upper, as Parcells has done in his career. A great example of institutionalizing change is IBM. Lou Gerstner rescued the firm in the early 90s, and then he wonderfully passed on his leadership to Sam Palmisano, who has led a successful transition and continues to lead the company profitably now. So what are our takeaways? Clearly, we want to create a sense of urgency. We want big, hairy, audacious goals that are simple, finite, far out, and stretch. We need to remember that multiple ways are necessary to communicate a vision, and small wins are important. The big idea here is that transformation is not an event, but a process. It's not a climactic battle, but a long, protracted campaign, and it has to start by getting people to wipe the slate clean of old ideas and mental models. Only then can you create a new vision.